Well, hello everyone, and thank you very much for being here today. My name is Ilan Wright, and I will be presenting on the topic of COVID-19, extreme weather events, and household food insecurity in BC. I'd like to first just ground us in a land acknowledgement and say that I feel extremely grateful and privileged to have conducted my work on the lands of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. So although I completed my practicum with the Healthy Communities team at the Ministry of Health, I wanted to explore my interests in food and nutrition policy. So I was fortunate enough to work with the Office of Nutrition Policy and Promotion with the ministry and BC Healthy Communities to support the development of their emergency food response framework. And while we are still in the middle of the pandemic, there still remains much to be uncovered about how food insecurity has been impacted. Likewise, climate change is increasingly recognized as a significant threat to food security and will undoubtedly impact all communities across BC in some way, whether by rising sea levels, floods, or wildfires. And so for my methods, I conducted a lit review of BC specific and Canadian publications dating from 2010 until present, focusing mostly on peer-reviewed journal articles and some gray lit as well. And my focus was primarily on food access and distribution. Just to give you a little bit of background on food insecurity and some of the pre-existing inequities, income obviously is a major driver of food insecurity, with higher rates experienced among those of lower socioeconomic status. The geographic isolation is a major factor as well. These types of communities, and in particular, remote Indigenous communities, are challenged with accessing adequate amounts of affordable and nutritious foods, as the cost of transportation and storage drives up the price of food. Indigenous people are disproportionately affected by food insecurity. In BC, recent research indicates that the rate of household food insecurity for Indigenous households living on reserve is 4 times the national or the provincial average of British Columbia. And for those experiencing household food insecurity, there's a major risk of developing chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension. And research is also showing that as the severity of food insecurity increases, the risk of developing anxiety, mood disorders, and depression increases as well. So these are 4 of the major themes that I kept coming across in the lit review I did and included in my report. Starting with the economic impacts of the pandemic. Right in the early months of the pandemic, we saw a major spike in unemployment, and this affected younger, hourly paid, and non-unionized workers, mostly in the food and hospitality sector due to the COVID-19 restrictions. And as a result, we saw higher rates of household food insecurity in BC and in Canada-wide. Higher rates of food insecurity were experienced by households with children, those who couldn't work from home, as well as individuals who were not able to work due to contracting the virus. Interestingly, when we compared pre-pandemic household food insecurity rates, the rates in the fall of 2020 were actually lower among vulnerable groups such as Indigenous people, households with children, and lone parent households. And it was really the introduction of those federal assistance programs like CERB that have been cited as the contributing factors to this decrease, which really does demonstrate the strong association between food insecurity and financial hardship. Of note, food insecurity during the pandemic really remained high for groups such as new immigrants and visible minorities. They already face more challenges in the labor market, including higher rates of unemployment and lower incomes. The cost of food also increased across Canada and BC due to the pandemic. This was part and due to increases in transportation costs and the supply chain disruptions, but extreme weather also had effect on crop yields across the country, and this was mostly due to the wildfires and droughts that were experienced. Food banks across Canada did really indicate that during the pandemic, lower rates of use were partially due to restrictions of movement due to public health guidelines or fear of contracting the virus. This was especially felt by seniors and people living with a disability or health condition. Some food bank clients actually stated that mobility issues that they live with really were hard for them, especially with some of the inconveniences around transportation, like rear loading of buses, and that made it really hard for them to access their food banks in the same way. Lineups, longer wait times, and less variety in food was also identified as problematic for some food bank clients. And many food banks experienced a drop in donations and deliveries of food. Supply chain disruptions also caused shortages of canned goods and impaired their ability to purchase in bulk and make purchases locally. A lack of transportation, funds, and staff were also identified as barriers for procuring food. Now, the pandemic also influenced food supply chains across BC and Canada, mostly due to a significant rise in demand. In the early months of the pandemic, panic buying and stockpiling of food items was observed as consumers really feared disruptions in availability. This phenomenon, along with labor shortages and border issues that affected the transportation of goods, did result in some food shortages. Unfortunately, low-income houses, they really do have less resources to stockpile food, and this resulted in more frequent grocery store trips, in turn increasing the risk of contracting the virus. Now, extreme weather events have also interrupted the supply of food in BC. We saw an example of this in 2021 when flooding and landslides in parts of the province caused supply chain disruptions due to the closure of several major highways. In turn, this caused food shortages as well. Along with the increase in panic buying, food shortages left many grocery stores across the province empty. As a result, increases in food bank was observed as well, and this created an even greater challenge for food bank operators to meet the needs of this increased needs, despite their own challenges with procurement. And we also saw that flooding caused damage to the properties of local farmers that provide essential items to these local food banks, such as meat, dairy, produce, and eggs. Now, the pandemic impacted food access for many remote communities in BC, and these communities are particularly vulnerable as well to the effects of extreme weather events on food security due to their reliance on transportation infrastructure and often a minimal ability to produce and store food locally. While supply chains were expressed among others, those issues, others were confronted with having to decide whether to close off their communities to the delivery of food due to reducing the risk of spreading the virus. For Indigenous people who rely on traditional foods, physical distancing guidelines impacted their harvesting routines as well, resulting in changes in practices for some, such as fishing alone or with household members only. Access to these foods can also be impacted by climate change, and we saw this with the wildfires, for example, which made it really difficult for some to access food. And so the decision to avoid or reduce accessing food from harvesting or foraging in this way can really have an immediate effect on food security, but also long-lasting effects due to the decline in the availability of the foods that result from the damage caused. So where do we go from here? Well, the pandemic and extreme weather events really demonstrate the need for a resilient food system, one that has the capacity to provide an adequate amount of appropriate and accessible food for everyone, even when faced with unexpected adversities. Local governments play an important role here in addressing food system resilient efforts that relate to land use and community services, as they're really able to leverage their strength to manage development and growth and adapt to climate change by overseeing developments of whole communities, protecting important land such as agricultural areas, and really enabling efficient infrastructure. Although adaptation planning is already taking place across the province, there is really a need to shift action into really supporting local food production, as this plays a critical role in meeting food needs of small cities and rural communities. This can include providing support for community-supported agriculture, community gardens, and innovation to inform the actions of grassroots community members. It's also important to include concrete actions in these plans that are, they're often criticized for their overuse of broad terms, and the lack of committal language and detailed policies can ultimately lead to a decreased probability of them being implemented. We can't talk either about moving forward without addressing Indigenous food sovereignty, as colonization, privatization, and climate change continue to have significant impacts on their access to traditional foods. In order to address the threat of climate change, on traditional foods, efforts really need to focus on strengthening the right to self-determination, connection, and stewardship of the land for Indigenous people. with priorities, values need to be recognized at all levels of government with respect to land use, development, conservation, and habitat protection, and really focusing on maintaining or enhancing to the availability of these high quality traditional foods. And without further ado, I will say thank you very much to everyone who was super supportive during my practicum and putting this project together. Some people from the ministry, some people from UVic, as well as my very supportive partner. So thank you very much, and I will take any questions.